recent outbreak of Ebola in Guinea and in West Africa. We thought it had a lot of parallels right now to the COVID epidemic and a lot of the like specific factors of how it emerged and how it's been spreading. So we thought, it'd be pretty relevant for that. So in February 2021, actually while they were having the COVID pandemic outbreak, they were also having a separate outbreak of Ebola in Guinea, and it started to spread a little bit out of it. It was less bad than it was in previous years, but there's still a fair amount of cases, 23 in Guinea with a case fatality rate of 52%, which is massive. And they had to shut down the whole country, or no, parts of the country. Last confirmed case was in April. It is currently unconfirmed with how it first originated, but since it is a zoonotic disease, the sort of assumption is that it might have had that, an animal host, probably a fruit bat, which have been frequently known to be reservoirs for it. And fruit bat was also actually the thing that probably caused the last big 13 to 2016 outbreak. And an alternate theory is actually that from the last outbreak, there was a patient 0 who sort of, I guess the Ebola virus used him as like an active reservoir for a while or something, and then ended up infecting him, he ended up possibly infecting other people with it. So the previous Ebola outbreak, it spread very quickly. It had a ton of cases. This one was significantly smaller. So we've had, a few dozen versus 28,000 previously. That one, if y'all remember it, shut down a lot of travel throughout the world and was very, very disruptive. Very high case fatality rate, especially for how many people were infected. And yeah, I guess turning over.
Okay, great. So, because we were part of the Planetary Health Tract, we decided to connect this to One Health. So briefly, we're just gonna go over One Health a little bit. It's basically that concept that recognizes that interrelationship between the humans, the animals, and the environment. And one way that we can take a One Health approach is to have an interdisciplinary and collaborative focus, which aims to work for the promotion of healthcare and research in a manner that reflects the acknowledgement of this interconnectedness. So I think we can go, so basically with zoonotic diseases, there are factors that can be related to One Health and the impact that humans have on their environment and with animals and kind of that triangulation. So it's possible that interaction with us and the environment and with animals can cause an increased spillover of these zoonotic infections into human populations. All right, next slide. So in concerns with Ebola, you can kind of read this, but basically fruit bats are considered a natural reservoir for the virus. There are many different theories as to how it started, how the Ebola outbreak started in West Africa. But one of the ideas, oh, sorry if my dog barks, is that it's possible there was a spillover effect from an infected fruit bat to a 2-year-old boy in a remote village in a forested area of southeastern Guinea. That's one possibility. Another researcher did some modeling analysis of 307 of the outbreaks in both West and Central Africa. And they found that a significant association between the recent deforestation events and the outbreaks of Ebola. So we've got population increases, we've got the need to put people somewhere to feed them, to create infrastructure, and this can come at a deficit to encroaching on natural habitats where some of these viruses and things that we don't even know about yet can naturally be. So it's kind of that interaction again. What else do I want to say about that? Yeah, everyone with me so far? Yay! All right, so we can talk about why this is important. basically, we have to really think about what we're doing. And thanks for the thumbs up. And the historical, colonial, colonization impacts, the Civil War outbreaks, the economic and political impacts that we as humans have on our environment, on each other, and on animals and our interactions. They think that the Ebola epidemic actually in West Africa highlights the fact that the zoonotic disease outbreaks may start occurring in a non-traditionally endemic region. So it kind of popped up in Guinea years later, right? And they kind of said that about COVID-19 as well. If you remember, it's in any type of pandemic situation where it's not a matter of if, but when these things are going to occur. So it's really up to us to start thinking about our human-animal interactions and what we're doing to the environment to kind of consider these things as we move forward. I'll go ahead, Jesse. And so again, kind of connecting it to COVID as well, this potential for global reach and how quickly, especially with globalization, things can travel. And I think for COVID-19, they're still looking at possibly a natural reservoir host, but there's some theories that bats might be natural hosts, as well as the pangolin, if I'm saying that right, 2 animals then that made jumps into humans and that we need to be aware of. So basically historical and political, economic, structural factors, we need to think about that in a One Health perspective and bring in people from, environmental health sciences, from medicine, from, even community planning and policies and where we build and how we build and how we take care of the earth, because it is interconnected, and that's kind of our point here. If we can temper progress with respect and understanding of that interconnectedness, then we can move forward in maybe a more a safer manner, perhaps. But we just thought it was kind of interesting that Ebola and COVID, as a side note, because we're going through it at the same time, are just 2 examples of how we can take a One Health approach and kind of look at those interactions to hopefully maybe mitigate these things in the future. So that's.
And as always, we can learn a lot from each. I mean, because I was looking up the Ebola vaccine that they're now actually implementing that was mentioned, and that's using adenovirus, which is now being used by Johnson & Johnson for the COVID vaccine. So there's a lot of interplay there for sure.
That's it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Jesse and Meredith, for that awesome presentation. We will now be transitioning to the impacts of air quality on respiratory health among vulnerable populations in California.
Sorry, just trying to present real quick. All right.
All right, wonderful. We good? Okay, perfect. Hi, today we're going to be presenting on the impacts of air quality on respiratory and mental health among vulnerable populations in California. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on the impacts of air quality on respiratory health. So many studies reveal that the onset of respiratory diseases are attributed to exposure to air pollutants and poor quality. The United States Environmental Protection Agency established 6 air pollutants associated with detrimental environmental and respiratory health outcomes: carbon monoxide, lead, nitrogen oxides, ozone, particulate matter, and sulfur oxides. These air pollutants are main contributors to poor air quality and in turn contributes to air pollution. Air pollution is associated with numerous adverse respiratory health outcomes, especially among vulnerable populations. The negative Respiratory health outcomes as a result of poor air quality include but are not limited to lung cancer, asthma, lung function impediments, and airway inflammations. Furthermore, particulate matter are one of the primary contributors to poor air quality. It comprises of both chemical components and physical environmental features such as dust, pollen, and smoke. These substances contribute to respiratory illnesses, especially among urban communities. And given the detrimental impacts of air quality on respiratory health among vulnerable populations, there's a call for collaborative research and work to address the respiratory health disparities among these marginalized communities. And a little bit of background about the change in air pollution during COVID. So for the first few weeks of the COVID-19 lockdowns, car and bus emissions dropped in California. In fact, on April 6th, 2020, Los Angeles had the cleanest air in the world. And in March and April of 2020, nitrous oxide, which I was just discussing and is a common tailpipe emission, dropped by 30% in Southern California. In addition, particulate matter concentrations dropped and public transit ridership decreased by nearly 80%. But after the initial quarantine, airborne pollutants rose once again, and combined with smoke from rampant wildfires during the summer and fall, made California unfortunately have some of the worst air quality in the world. Thank you.
So when we were thinking about California populations, we wanted to look at more underserved, underprivileged populations, and that really led us to focus on farm workers in the Central Valley. Something that I always think of when thinking about this population is that they kind of get hit from every possible side. And something that really plays into the kind of planetary health aspect of it is use of pesticides that go into growing all the food that we eat, that they harvest. So these pesticides that are aerosolized, sprayed over these fields have impacts on these people's respiratory health. Research has shown that early life and childhood exposure to organophosphate pesticides, which is a lot of what is used, even though they are considered toxic airborne substances, is associated with development of asthma and respiratory symptoms in children as they progress through life. Exposure to these pesticides has also been linked to asthma, chronic respiratory symptoms, chronic bronchitis, COPD, lung cancer, and these are only the respiratory health symptoms. It can have long-term health effects throughout the rest of the body. And companies that employ these people can fail and have failed previously to properly train and protect their employees. And this can lead to and has led to accidental mass pesticide exposure, where you have people who aren't supposed to be exposed to these chemicals, supposed to be kept at distance, or these chemicals supposed to be handled properly, have been exposed to them. And there have been stories that, these people saw a cloud of pesticide and they thought they were going to die, and have had to have, extensive lab work, hospital work to kind of see how that exposure will play out. Next slide. Sorry, can you go back one? Yeah. So respiratory health disparities among vulnerable groups. If we look, either in California or throughout the United States, we see, large differences. We found that asthma was more prevalent in lower income families that fall below the poverty line, as well as highest among Black and Puerto Rican populations. Hispanic, Black, and Asian or Pacific Islander mothers were more susceptible to adverse respiratory conditions due to air pollution compared to white moms. And we also found that less than 20% of farm workers have public health insurance. And this obviously decreases their access to healthcare whether it's physical health care or mental health care, like we will talk about. And they've also found that children living near to highways or to these pesticide use sites, like many farm worker families live pretty close to the sites where they work, have increased risk of asthma and higher risk of developing chronic respiratory symptoms. Next slide. So the impact of air pollution on mental health is something that is really overlooked, especially here in populations in California, because we did say, you know, a lot of these farm workers don't have access to healthcare, much less mental health care. And it's been shown that the impact of air pollution exposure to not only the air pollution that they get here in California, where the Central Valley has some of the worst air quality ever, but also the wildfires, the pesticides. All of this can cause neurocognitive effects that can affect their mental health. So air pollutant particulate matter can induce inflammation and oxidative stress in the brain, and then that can manifest itself as mental illness. Rates of depression are 2 times higher for each 10 micrograms of increase in nitrogen dioxide, which is found in a lot of fertilizers that are used. And then long-term exposure can also increase odds of depression and lead people to use antidepressants.
All right, and so we're going to be continuing with the impact of air pollution on mental health and kind of just focusing on the vulnerable population in California, which is our farm workers. And so as you can see, agricultural workers have several risk factors that affect their mental health as well. So it's not limited to just, you know, like pesticide use, but it's their circumstances as well. And this includes financial difficulties, climate variabilities, aka working with drought conditions, air quality, so the physical environment that surrounds them. Also poor housing, as Alexa was mentioning, that lots of these farmers are sometimes kept on to the sites where they work. And this is not due to they want to be close to where they work, but rather the companies that they work with don't let them venture out and, like, you know, have their independence. So they're kind of limited to how far they can go out. And also high rates of chronic stress. A lot of these farm workers are undocumented, so that adds to their troubles as well. And due to this undocumented status, they don't have access to healthcare and they don't qualify for Medicaid. And so this kind of just acts as a barrier to healthcare. And so even when someone's going through something really, you know, extreme, they can't go and get the help that they need. And so this basically induces triggers such as suicide rates are very high in farmers, farm managers, and agricultural laborers. So all different types of farm workers are being impacted by the system. And a systematic review compares the health of farm worker mental health with other occupations and found that 71% of studies suggest that farmers have worse mental health issues than the general population. So if you're a farm worker, you're 71% more likely to, you know, experience this stress. And yeah. And yeah, so we're also going to be talking about how the California wildfires and COVID-19 had impacted these, like basically the health conditions. And so according to the CAL FIRE website, there were 2,265 fires between January 1st, 2021 and May 23rd. And that's just this year in itself. And as we can see in the past, we've just had, like, you know, our state struggles with lots of wildfires, and these workers are still going out and, you know, doing their hard work, making sure that we have food on our tables. And so Cal OSHA requires N95 masks for air quality indexes of 151 plus. And so basically it's, again, horrible working conditions for these laborers because they're still being forced to be in the forefront working and collecting food while lots of people are evacuating, or, you know, these fires are pretty close to them as well. And so last year in 2020, 4 major wildfires erupted across Central California, as well as the coast. And because of COVID-19, there was another barrier to PPE. And because, everyone was stocking up on masks and everyone was scrambling to collect them as well, these farm workers were not getting the resources that they needed. So they were already in these tough working conditions, but on top of that, they didn't have the proper PPE required to work. And they were still, on the field working and just being disproportionately impacted. And so we also wanted to present some solutions that we think would be helping this problem. And so it includes increasing funding for mental health resources to underserved communities in California. And so just by allocating funds, as well as creating resources, people can kind of, get help in ways that they would need. So they would have whatever agencies that they need. And also a call for legislator requiring controlled burns to decrease wildfire incidents. And basically, once you have controlled burns in the area, you're getting the result you need, but it's not going to be, things won't be blowing out of control. And so this is just something that you would have to work with local policymakers. On top of that, we want to increase funding for more practical and sustainable public transport, just because a lot of farm workers don't have access to transportation. So just by improving the public transportation systems, they'll be getting more access and kind of can stretch more far out and have access to hospitals or clinics or whatever sites are needed. Kind of with COVID-19, we can see even vaccine access, if someone can't come to you to give you the vaccine, we need to increase public transportation efforts to make sure that farm workers are able to go out and receive these. And also provide funding for health education, particularly for farm workers. And, once again, the COVID-19 pandemic highlights this in ways that where people don't know what's going on. They have this mistrust against the information. They're going to be more inclined to not participate in healthy activities. And so by increasing health education, making sure that the correct and proper information is being reached out to these communities, you're more likely to increase just access to healthcare. Also by decreasing pesticide use and replacing it with alternatives to OPs. This is going to help just because pesticide use, as previously mentioned, has very harmful effects. And by decreasing its use, you're kind of just going to be taking up one of those agents that causes inequities in healthcare. And we also wanted to develop provide farm workers with proper PPE, just making sure that everyone has the resources to do proper work, but also developing a form of health insurance to make sure that workers are covered and have access to healthcare. And so this is something that's going to be large scale, just because, like previously mentioned, Medicaid does not cover undocumented workers. So we need to make sure that, if someone's working, that they are covered and they do have access to healthcare. And also regulating emissions from larger cities, just as lots of weather patterns do carry air pollution from larger cities like Los Angeles or San Francisco into the Central Valley, where it kind of just pools in the valley. And so once you start regulating emissions from these larger sites, you're going to notice some differences in air quality. And lastly, supporting worker rights, especially during harsh working conditions, to make sure that workers aren't being exploited. This means working with labor unions or just, creating agencies that support farm workers and making sure that these workers have an outlet to, resources once they're going through these different situations. And lastly, we just wanted to include all our references. This is all the studies that we use to conduct this presentation. And thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Baljot, Alana, and Alexa for that awesome presentation. We'll now be transitioning to the climate change inequities seen by industrial northern cities and their effects on southern countries.
All right. So we have a recording because one of our group mates is actually graduating today and couldn't present live. So we just went ahead and recorded it for you guys. Just start.
Everyone, this is the Planetary Health Concentration of Expertise Group 3. My name is Cooper Limon, and I'm accompanied by Mariella Sanding, Zoe Che, and Austin Hudson. We are presenting today on climate change inequities, and our research was guided by our central question of how does climate injustice lead to global health inequities? Okay, so here's a slight intro to climate inequity. So through our research, we noticed that a lot of researchers have begun to notice trends about climate inequity over the past couple decades, and have kind of located their research around the idea that global South countries seem to be facing much more of the hazard and risks of a warming planet that has largely been caused by global North or industrialized countries. The map on the right is a perfect example of this because it shows that the proportion of total historical greenhouse gas emissions per country is largely concentrated in North American, European, and East Asian countries. Here, I cited a reference that 80% of all current greenhouse gas emissions, with more than 40% of emissions, are coming from just China and the US. Historically, the US is responsible for more than 25% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And these emissions are directly linked to climate change. And we focused on heat, drought, and disease and illness as three major health hazards caused by climate change, which are directly related to greenhouse gas emissions. So each three of members of the group are going to talk about those 3 points.
Yeah, so as Cooper said, we'll kind of be talking about different effects that it's had. I'll be talking about the increasing heat, especially in the global South. As you can see on the map, those are countries that are more at risk for the major effects of climate change in the future. Increasing heat is a big risk for the elderly as well as people with pre-existing conditions, and wreaks havoc on your cardiovascular system in the future. Extreme heat has become more frequent, severe, and has lasted longer in almost all regions of the world since the 1950s, but most severely in the Middle East, South America, and parts of Africa. So the number of people in African countries exposed to dangerous heat will grow 20-fold before the end of this decade, which is quite scary. Rising temperatures in India, Nepal, and parts of China are increasing as well. Some places in India will have a wet bulb temperature, which is both humidity and outside temperature calculated together, of over 35 degrees Celsius. At that point, it is impossible for humans to survive for more than a few hours. And that is due to the fact that we can't produce enough sweat to cool us off in that time. And so it's very scary that a lot of these countries in the global South are facing this, especially when it is going to become impossible for humans to survive in that area. Another major point is that a lot of these areas already don't have the strongest health infrastructure to combat the growing temperatures. So I just want to leave y'all on that, and I'll pass it off to Mariella.
Another example of climate inequities caused by northern countries is the issue of droughts. Lesser developed countries in the southern hemisphere are suffering the most from the impacts of drought due to physical, social, and economic differences. And although droughts are seen globally, the effects are predominantly seen in southern countries as they lack the infrastructure to repair and prevent the damages caused by drought. And the overexploitation of water resources by northern countries leaves developing southern countries with scarce water supplies. An example of this is seen in Central Africa, when in the 1980s, this region experienced a decade of drought. This caused Lake Chad, which is a shallow lake used to water crops in neighboring countries, to almost dry out completely. And initially, the drought was blamed on overgrazing and bad agricultural practices, but recent research conducted by the University of Washington analyzed how the drying of Lake Chad was actually a result of global warming. And the researchers argued that the drought was due in large part to northern hemisphere pollution. The aerosols flowing from coal burning factories in the US and Europe during the 1960s to the 1980s cooled the entire northern hemisphere, which shifted tropical rain bands south. So rains no longer reach the Sahel region, which is a band that spans the African continent just below the Sahara Desert. It's important to note that not only do these particles from aerosols pollute air locally, they also have remote climate effects. Later on, when the Clean Air Act in the US and Europe passed, the rain band shifted back, which lessened the drought in the southern hemisphere. So the unintended positive effect from the Clean Air Act improved more than air quality and health-related benefits. And although shorter-term droughts continue to affect the Sahel, the long-term drought began to recover after the 1980s. So this drought in Sahel is just one example of the lingering effects of climate change caused by northern countries. And now I'll pass it off to Austin.
All right, so thank you. So I'm going to be talking about some of the diseases and illnesses that can result from global emissions and climate change. Air pollutions can cause the leading cause of aggravating factors for respiratory illnesses like COPD, asthma, and lung cancer. So like infant exposure to nitrous oxides can increase their risk for developing asthma later in life. Another thing is COPD hospitalizations have increased in areas of higher air pollution, which is typically in the South. And then also you'll see increased risk for lung cancers in places with more road traffic. And then another issue or diseases that can come from climate change would be like increase or decrease in infectious diseases. So the changes in habitat and environment create, increase, and decrease suitable habitats for infectious disease vectors. So for example, you'll have temperature and precipitation are key factors in determining a habitat suitable for mosquitoes and ticks, which are vectors for West Nile virus, dengue fever, and Lyme disease, respectively. And then dengue fever has increased in incidence in the past 50 years, which correlates with an increase in the global emissions. And then another issue that can come from global emissions and climate change would be like extreme weather events, which can exacerbate current chronic illnesses that people have. So like the extreme weather can disrupt public health systems and lead to an adverse effect on the health of overall populations. Heat waves and floods are the leading weather-related causes of death. And something like flooding can be a physical barrier to facilities or healthcare. So people need to go to pharmacies to get their drugs or go to the hospital for whatever reason. Flooding can physically stop them from being able to do that and obtain that help. So in short, just a few countries are impacting the health of the entire world. Like Cooper said earlier, 8% of the emissions are coming from just about like 20 countries. And so I'm going to just go ahead and pass it back to Cooper with some conclusions and suggestions.
Thank you for those 3 health dangers. And it's clear that global South countries are really taking the brunt of these adverse health effects that are caused by global North countries. And so kind of knowing the disproportionate amount of historical GHG emissions and the responsibility for climate change in total lies in the hands of a few global North countries, it is really their ethical and moral responsibility to deal with these effects. The UN has implemented several strategies to kind of address climate inequities. And one of the first strategies that I pointed out was common but differentiated responsibilities, where global North countries actually have a greater responsibility to deal with the effects of global warming than global South countries do. So this will kind of come in the form of having stricter emission reduction strategies, or even having to commit larger amounts of money to things like the Global Climate Fund, which is money for global South countries to access in case of extreme climate disasters, like hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, etc., that are exacerbated and perpetuated by greenhouse gas emissions. There are a lot of other things that global North countries can do to kind of repay global South countries for all the damage that they have caused. This can be in the form of technology transfer, more aid, so many different things. So we just kind of wanted to expose what climate inequity is, some of the different effects that global South countries feel, like increased heat, drought, and disease and illness. And we kind of just wanted to give a few recommendations that global North countries can continue to do and can do in the future to kind of close the situation and repay their debt in a way. So thank you for listening to this, and we hope you guys learned something.
And that will conclude our video.
Great, thank you, Austin, for sharing your group's recording. That was really interesting. And we will now move on to a Women's Health, Gender, and Empowerment presentation on the inclusion of women in politics.
Hi, thank you. I'm just trying to see if, oh yeah, okay, great. I think Kathy's gonna share the presentation.
Can everyone see it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yay. Okay, thank you everyone. So today we're going to be presenting on the inclusion of women in politics. Specifically, we're going to be exploring how lack of representation in policy making affects women's health outcomes, specifically in the US. And I'll explain why we focus on the US a little later on. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what do we mean and why does it matter? The UN highlights that women's equal participation and leadership in political and public life are essential to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Women need to have more meaningful representation in national, local, and community leadership roles and the political process. For example, we need more women as political leaders, elected policymakers, civil society activists, members of Congress, and many more. Women's participation in politics help advance gender equality and affects both the range of policy issues that get considered and the types of solutions that are proposed. Research indicates that whether a legislator is male or female has direct impact on their policy priorities. There is also strong evidence that as more women are elected to office, there is an increase in policy making that emphasizes equality of life and reflects the priorities of families, women, and racial minorities. Okay, next. So now I just want to go over some statistics provided by the UN. Women serve as head of state or government in only 22 countries, and 119 countries have never had a woman leader. At the current rate, gender equality in the highest positions of power will not be reached for another 130 years. Only 25% of all national parliamentarians are women. That's up from 11% in 1995, but not by much. At the current rate of progress, gender parity in national legislative bodies will not be reached before 2063. There is established and growing evidence that women's leadership in political decision-making processes improves them. For example, research on local councils in India discovered that the number of drinking water projects in the area with women-led councils was 62% higher than those with men-led councils. In Norway, they discovered a positive relationship between the presence of women in municipal councils and childcare coverage. Okay, next. So why focus on the US? The US paints itself as a leader in economics, politics, equality, freedom, and democracy, but this is a false narrative. Other countries have surpassed the US in terms of the inclusion of women in politics, and it's a big issue that we're lagging behind. 19 countries have reached or surpassed 40% of women in parliament, including 9 countries in Europe, 5 in Latin America and the Caribbean, 4 in Africa, and 1 in the Pacific. These countries also show higher rates of overall happiness, which is an interesting correlation. More than 2/3 of these countries have applied gender quotas, meaning opening space for women's political participation in national parliaments. The US ranks 75th out of 193 countries in terms of women's representation in government. Even this year's historical percentage of women held congressional seats doesn't even meet the global average of 24.1 representation. Even so, some countries continue to view America as the standard bearer of freedom, equality, and creativity. Generations of Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America have grown up under the influence of the superpower US. So if the US does not improve on its inclusion of women in politics and policy-making decisions and set a good example, other countries might not think it's so important. Is Nora here? No worries, I'll just present on this slide. So as mentioned earlier, so based on this figure 14 right here, some female characteristics seem well suited for top political decision-making positions. Empathy, listening, willingness to compromise. However, women are underrepresented in top elected political positions in the US. So as figure 14 shows, there has been significant progress since 1990, but the levels remain fairly low. Next slide. So that's made even more clear when we compare across countries. So figure 15 shows that the US lags behind nearly all other rich democratic nations in the share of legislative seats held by women. So that's pretty sad. Okay, next. Okay, so some possible reasons for this. So there are so many issues, but for the sake of time, we'll just focus on 3. So one key cause is our winner-take-all single-member district electoral system. So most other rich democratic democracies have elections in which voters cast ballots for parties rather than candidates. And so given that many voters still aren't fully accustomed to women as major elected politicians, it's easier for women to gain office via a party list than via US-style candidate-centered winner-take-all election. A second key cause is quotas that major parties in some countries have adopted. This is a straightforward way to increase the number of women on party lists, and thus an effective way to increase the number of women who gain seats in parliament. And unfortunately, the US does not have this. And then the third key cause is limited family-friendly policies. Our federal government mandates 12 weeks of unpaid family leave in a medium-sized firm. A few states have paid parental leave policies, and very few others have preschool to 4-year-olds. So too many women have to take large chunks of time out to care for children, which reduces their work experience and limits their time to take on high-profile political jobs. Okay, next.
Okay, so I'm gonna take over this part. So obviously, like the lack of women inclusion in politics has led to like pretty dramatic consequences. If anybody's been paying attention to the news lately, a few weeks ago, Texas passed a law that banned abortion effectively after 6 weeks. And that's kind of dramatic because that's only 2 weeks after a missed period. And so after 6 weeks, most women don't even know they're pregnant. And this was a law that was signed by Governor Abbott. And so that's like a very serious consequence of the lack of women within political representation. It's because our voices aren't heard, our perspectives aren't taken into consideration. And so as a result, we have men making most of the decisions over how, over the control that we can have over our bodies. And this is kind of a theme within Republican politics as well, where we seem to have like this wall of women kind of covering this giant group of men whenever these sorts of laws seem to take place. And so really what's important is having that representation within politics, especially American politics, and giving women the space to speak from their perspectives and also talk about things like their own bodily control. Okay. And so obviously here are some of the solutions that we came up with as a group. We mentioned applying quotas because of the severe lack of, because of our lagging behind in women in politics. It looks unlikely that we're going to reach parity anytime soon unless we institute some of the quotas that were mentioned previously that are instituted in other countries. Another really important thing is invoking family-friendly policies. Without those policies put in place, most of the responsibility of taking care of the family falls on the women inevitably, and that's likely due to cultural reasons, of course. And so if we really use policy to let women to give women the freedom to explore their career options, that would be very useful as well. And finally, a really important thing too is early empowerment of younger girls. Again, this is also a cultural thing. We just don't seem to encourage girls to really pursue their dreams and tell them that they want to do a lot of things that we don't really encourage them to like really pursue positions of power, even though they are very capable. And obviously, early empowerment has to be very tactful. I think that there's a lot of issues that can come as a result if we're not very careful about it. But it is important to understand that we should be empowering young girls to pursue their dreams and really try to right some of the wrongs that they see in the world. Okay. And so here are our resources, and that should conclude our presentation. Thank you for listening.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that interesting presentation. We will now be transitioning to our last presentation of the day on centering AAPI communities in discussions of reproductive health.
Thanks, Alexis. Just let me share my screen really quickly. All right. Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about centering AAPI communities in discussions of reproductive health. So to provide a little bit of background, Asian American and Pacific Islander women are a fast-growing population in the US. And currently, there are over 5.6 million women in the US who identify with these groups. And these women have diverse social demographics, health needs, and access to healthcare services. And our motivation for looking at this population was because these women experience this barrier to care in the sense that there are a lack of linguistically and culturally appropriate services for these women. And they commonly experience discrimination by gender and race in healthcare, and many of them are excluded from reproductive health clinical trials, leaving many questions unanswered about their own reproductive health.
Next, we will talk about the experiences of AAPI communities with sexual and reproductive health. A study published in 2016 explored how sexual and reproductive health information is shared with Asian American families and what are some of the barriers associated with receiving adequate health care. Most of the participants report stigma as the major barrier to discuss these healthcare issues within the household. A lot of the females reported that their families did not discuss preventive healthcare. Some strategies suggested by the participants included increased communication within the community and increased access to healthcare information. In some cases, this also involved strategies that can help maintain confidentiality, like credible online sources, or even encouraging healthcare providers to provide information about sexual health and the available resources. Another study published in 2020 aimed to understand the sexual and reproductive health needs of female youth experiencing homelessness, or by EH, among the AAPI communities. One of their key interventions under study was Bahini, or Women Talk, a holistic trauma-informed intervention which was introduced for female youth experiencing homelessness to improve their well-being and connect them to sexual health resources. Photo voice as a participatory action approach was used, where participants were tied due to a shared experience or identity. The researchers assessed the impact of Bahini Talk and the key themes of youth-driven birth timing decisions, a sense of place or finding safe spaces, and glimpsing hope. Most of the females who participated in the study highlighted the need for emphasis on reproductive justice, financial stability, and affordable housing.
I focused on sex-selective abortion bans, which are bans that make it illegal for a doctor to perform an abortion if there is even a suspicion that the patient is seeking it due to a preference for the sex of the baby. And these bans are problematic because they cloak racist stereotypes and anti-abortion sentiment under the guise of gender equity concerns. And they build on the unfounded stereotype that AAPI individuals come to the US with quote unquote backwards ideals that include desiring male children over female children. These bans are a slippery slope towards demeaning the agency of AAPI women and pregnant individuals in healthcare. And they undermine doctor-patient relationships by requiring doctors to report if they suspect there is a sex preference. And they jeopardize AAPI communities' health and decrease the already insubstantial availability of culturally competent and linguistically apt care. I put this map to show how sex-selective abortion bans are often in flux and up for a vote in various states. And they're often a facet of anti-abortion laws in the US. And in 2018, the US Court of Appeals for Seventh Circuit determined Indiana's sex-selective abortion ban unconstitutional. So that kind of shows how they're coming into like lawmaking in different states at different times and like being deemed unconstitutional. But yeah, they're definitely a current issue.
Sorry. AAPI women have been overrepresented in sex work throughout U.S. history, starting with the Page Act of 1875 that prevented Chinese women from immigrating to the U.S. because of the assumption that they were prostitutes. This shows how Asian female immigrants' bodies have been policed and hypersexualized in the U.S. for over 100 years. Sex work often becomes the last resort when other opportunities are unavailable, especially common for immigrants. Many spas and massage parlors are fronts for sex work that specifically prey on Asian immigrant women. Many AAPI women are faced with going into sex work or being sex trafficked. The shootings in Atlanta were motivated because of an assumption that the victims were sex workers. The police killing of Yang Song that occurred in 2017 was also linked to her involvement in sex work. These incidents and more show that the protection of sex workers must be at the center of AAPI reproductive justice movements. Anti-sex trafficking efforts often bring more police into the scene, which leads to threats of police brutality and deportation for immigrants. Decriminalization of sex work will help protect victims of sexual exploitations and will create a safer environment for women to work and live. It is a necessary step for the protection of those in sex work and for the AAPI community. Next slide. These images show an art activism perspective on sex work. Members of the Red Canary Song, an activism group for the rights of Asian parlor workers, staged an installation as part of the Sex Workers Pop-Up Art Show. This was a free exhibit featuring the artwork and performances by and about sex workers from around the world.
Okay, so this slide will be for one of our teammates who couldn't make it today, but this is about AAPI youth, specifically talking about sexual health. And according to a 2016 study, which was published in the Journal of Adolescent Research, Asian American adolescents had the lowest rates of communications with their physicians and healthcare providers, especially pertaining to topics about sexual health. This study eventually revealed that most participants had either lied to a healthcare provider about their sexual history because of confidential concerns, and this was due to the fact that these providers, for many of their participants, were chosen by their parents and not by the preference of the patient themselves. And this was believed to be the main barrier due to contraceptive use, especially from parental opposition. And also there was a general lack of knowledge about STIs and contraception when compared to their non-Asian peers. Overall, the study expressed that participants had the desire for healthcare providers to initiate conversations about sexual health and to explicitly discuss the confidentiality of these topics. And so lastly, we wanted to just discuss an organization that is doing really incredible work. This is called the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. And there's currently quite a few chapters across the country, 7 to be exact. However, I thought it was really interesting that there's none on the West Coast. I believe the closest is in Arizona. So I thought that was very interesting. And their main focus is on reproductive health and rights, economic justice, and immigrant rights and racial justice, again, specifically for Asian American and Pacific individuals. And their mission is to work to build a movement for both social, political, and structural change for Asian American and Pacific Islander women and girls. And I thought that it was a really great organization that has laid out a lot of their missions, and they've been involved in really great news articles and stories and things that have been published about this specific issue. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for that awesome presentation. And so I did want to open it up to everyone if there were any questions for any of the presentations that you saw today, or you can drop it in the chat or to just ask one another. So we did want to present that option. Any pressing questions from anyone? And if not, that's also totally fine. But I did want to really quick for tomorrow, just a heads up. Hopefully you all can still attend and support other student ambassadors who will be presenting tomorrow. And so we will have these groups presenting on day 2 tomorrow. And then we will also be, if you are unable to attend, we will be sending a follow-up email just with the post-program survey and just a couple follow-up items. But we want to just thank you again for all of your participation and engagement in the program and these really interesting presentations. I feel like I was able to learn a lot today. And if it's okay with some folks, I know we're ending about 30 minutes early. I do want to, oh, are we getting questions? Okay. Well, I'll just pause on I do want to take a group photo, but if there are questions, please feel free to chime in.
If any of the presenters want to address Dr. Jenny Lane's question, if you are able to and interested in sharing your most surprising things that you learned when researching for your presentation, if anyone would like to share, we'd love to hear it.
I think I can try and answer it.
Thank you.
So one thing I noticed is that we always talk about, how different populations are disproportionately affected, and we're aware that there are, these factors that, cause these inequities. But when you research it, you actually see what they look like and how many there are. And sometimes they range from more than what you were thinking about or more than what you were aware of. And so it just puts into perspective about how privileged you are. And when we were researching the farm workers, I was just caught off guard about how much work that they actually do and how much credit, less credit they receive. And so it was just really eye-opening to see the statistics and see how they work so hard for us essentially, and the least we can do is just support them. But yeah, just being aware of the inequities.
I'll go. I think for my group, it was the thing that surprised me the most was how much China and the US alone account for the global emissions and the amount. I knew it would be a significant amount, but I didn't realize it would be that much. So I really think that's what really shocked me.
So for me, it was, the image I have of the Ebola epidemic is still what I had in 2015, 16 when it was at its height. I remember seeing, news clips of people dying on TV and, body bags and everything, the hazmat suits and all. And then comparing that to what it is now, it actually genuinely surprised me how much better health agencies now are at containing the virus, and especially with the vaccine and how much that helps. It's a world of the difference between what it is now and what it was then. So I was just very happy to see that.
Thank you for sharing all of those sort of just little insights and learnings. I think it's fun to hear what else didn't, your opinion and what came out of it. So I really appreciate you guys sharing some of that. Thank you. Loved the presentations.
Yeah, this is Pat Conrad, one of the co-directors. I just want to say great job, everyone. Those were impressive presentations. And to all of you who have participated in the program, we hope that it's been worthwhile. We hope that it's given you some new perspectives and helped strengthen what knowledge you already had, and maybe even shaped a little bit your thinking about how you want to proceed in the future with your careers. Hopefully you'll all, I know we have another group tomorrow, and I'll be there. But I just for everybody, we hope you stay connected to UCGHI. We hope you're part of the pipeline that goes on to whatever exciting things that you're going to be doing. Hopefully, well, I mean, it's pretty clear from your presentations and all the discussions that you understand that, you know, global is global, local, totally interconnected, and it's everything. You know, it's that impacts our health, the health of animals, the health of the environment. Yeah, I just really, yeah, it's been great meeting you all, and wonderful to see what you've learned and what you've been able to accomplish. I think Jennifer's got her hand up. Hey, Jennifer. Love
Hey,
that painting in
everyone.
the background. Looking cool.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I actually called in earlier on my phone, so I heard all of the presentations on my phone, and I learned so much from listening to all of you. So I want to thank you for all of the work that you did. My question is actually kind of something that may not be a question that you can or want to answer right now, but it's kind of thinking forward as to what recommendations would you all have in terms of how we could incorporate some of your findings into the ongoing work of the two COEs. Because I think you've come up with so many wonderful, such knowledge, and also so many really innovative and helpful suggestions. So I would encourage each of you to really think about what you could envision ways in which we could tap in some of your findings into our ongoing work, and also for new initiatives. And we would love to involve any of you who are interested in trying to make some of these projects or ideas come to fruition. So, but I would love to hear if anyone has immediate thoughts on that. Would be great to hear, and just kind of put out a plug for staying in touch, even though this year is coming to an end. It would be great to hear how you think we could incorporate these issues into ongoing work.
I can go. I think that looking into, I think we have a lot of work to do to, I think, look into pesticide alternatives to organophosphates. I think is going to be a pretty big undertaking that California will inevitably have to go through in the next few years. I guess not few years, probably decades. And I think that the UC system has a lot of resources that could go towards that, both on the medical side and on the agricultural side. And so I think just doing work looking into that, and public education regarding pesticides, regarding pesticide alternatives, and also organic farming. I think a lot of people think organic farming and they think like, why would I buy the same food just for a higher price? But I think a lot of people don't understand kind of the ramifications of an impact that they could have if they purchase organic. So
thank you, Alexa.
I was just going to add what Jennifer Wagman just said. Reach out. I mean, connect with the COEs in your area of interest. The leadership are listed on website, and also then you've got your marvelous facilitators here in the from the COEs, Stephanie and Alex, also to reach out and connect. The summer is a great time. I mean, faculty are less overwhelmed, and if you lead with that you're a UCGHI ambassador, and that we've encouraged you to reach out and just be sure you know what's happening now and in the future, and how you can be involved if you'd like, how that could help you in your career. It was a good question, Jennifer.
Yeah, and definitely thank you for following up, Pat. I think also irrespective of what COE you're in, I think we've all realized there's so much overlap between what both of our COEs are doing. Just as an example, for the past several years, I've been involved with research in Kern County, looking at the significantly increasing rates of sexually transmitted infections among adults. And with some of the infections, primarily syphilis, there's a big uptick of mother to child transmission. And I think, in our research, we've found that there are so many determinants of what's going on that really tap into what you all were talking about regarding the issues that farm workers are dealing with. And there's just so much intersectionality. So like Pat said, please do feel free to reach out, because oftentimes we have opportunities for students to get involved, but just don't know who's interested. So yeah, I would love to hear from any of you, and I know that the same goes for the other leaders of the COEs and UCGHI. But great.
Jennifer, I should know this, but I don't. Is the Women's Health, Gender and Empowerment COE, are you having an internship program? Have you been able to, or have you got that on hold because of COVID? Any kind of internship opportunities?
We do. I think Stephanie and Dallas are probably the best people to speak to that. I don't think Melissa is here, but there are internship opportunities. Stephanie, if you want to chime in a little bit there.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Pat. We did release our internship opportunities program. Because of COVID, they are still remote, but we did have a good number of internships, and actually a good number of student ambassadors who ended up being awarded a $1,000 stipend and got matched to internships. So they'll all be starting soon. And there are actually a number of them who are working with Dallas this summer.
Yeah, they just came to my mind because I was on the summer launch for the Planetary Health Center of Expertise internships, and with the mentors and everything. And that's another thing. I mean, those are maybe set for this summer already, but just for the future, all of you, look out for that, because that could be another great way to build on your experience. And you're already known as ambassadors, so you already have one step forward in that process.
Are there any additional questions from students or from our leadership team? Well, I don't want to hold anyone longer, but there are also more questions. If you have additional questions, please, as everyone's mentioned, feel free to reach out. But I do want to encourage everyone right now, if you can turn on your camera, if we can take a group shot really quickly. And just thank you again for everyone for these amazing presentations today. So let's see. Thank you. I see all these great faces. Okay, I will take it on 3. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. Great, I'll take one more because I need to go to the other side. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. And we hope to see you at tomorrow's presentation for day 2. And there will be a little fun activity that Alex has planned at the end. So I hope you all can join us. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.